Hi, this is Dr. Brent Kelly, and we're going through Lesson 2, which is a sober look at utilitarianism and deontology. Now, there are two major ethical theories that attempt to specify and justify moral rules and principles. They are utilitarianism and deontology. Utilitarianism, also called consequentialism, is a moral theory developed and refined in the modern world in the writings of Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Now, there are several varieties of utilitarianism, but basically, a utilitarian approach to morality implies that there are no moral acts, that is, like an act of stealing, or a rule, like keep your promises, which are intrinsically right or wrong. Rather, the rightness or wrongness of an act or rule is solely a matter of the overall non-moral good. That is, what happens, the result, pleasure or happiness or health or knowledge or satisfaction of individual desire produced within the consequences of doing that act or following that rule. In other words, according to utilitarianism, morality is a matter of the non-moral good produced that results from moral actions and rules, and moral duty is instrumental. That is, it is not inherent. Morality is a means to some other end. It is in no way an end of itself. Space does not allow for a detailed critique of utilitarianism here. Suffice it to say that the majority of moral philosophers and theologians have found this idea defective. One main problem is that utilitarianism, if adopted, justifies as more morally appropriate things that are clearly immoral. For example, utilitarianism can be used to justify punishing an innocent man or enslaving a small group of people if such an act produces a maximization of consequences. But these acts are clearly immoral regardless of how fruitful they might be for the greater number. Did you catch that? Good. Critics of utilitarianism kept tossing examples like the one I've just mentioned, like hand grenades. By the time British philosopher G.E. Moore, 1873 to 1958, published his book in 1903, utilitarianism had begun to turn into a non-hedonistic, non-self-centered direction. The non-hedonistic version of utilitarianism practiced by Moore and others came to be known as ideal utilitarianism. Its basic thesis was that we should always act in a way that produces the greatest amount of goodness, not just the greatest amount of pleasure. It should be so self-centered. For several decades, many people believed that this was the kind of emphasis on consequences that would work. But this view was proven deficient. This often happened by the use of contrasting scenarios, in which the ideal utilitarian position ended up supporting unjust situations. Now, one can see how easily this could happen, since it can be very difficult to define what exactly any society means by good. Well, another challenge here is that the community or the government or the society or the authorities ultimately decide what is best for that group of people, for that society. This type of communitarian ethic, has historically failed either because the community is selfish or the society will justify which rules or laws it uses to govern its people. So unjust laws that are passed because it is for the greater good of the society, leaving the oppressed minority powerless to oppose injustice. For this and other reasons, many thinkers have advocated a second type of moral theory, deontological ethics. Deontological ethics can be in keeping with Scripture, natural law, and institutions of common sense. The word deontological comes from the Greek word deon, which means binding duty. So you can see Deontology is connected with law or duty, a requirement that one has to do. Deontological ethics have at least three important features. The first, duty, should be done for duty's sake. The rightness or wrongness of an act is, at least in part, a matter of the inherent moral features of that kind of act or rule. For example, acts of lying, promise breaking, or murder are intrinsically wrong, and we have a duty not to do those things. This does not mean that consequences of acts are not relevant for addressing those acts. For example, a doctor may have a duty to benefit a patient, and he or she may need to know what medical consequences would result from various treatments in order to determine what would be beneficial or not beneficial for the patient. But consequences are not what makes that act right or wrong, as in the case of utilitarianism. Rather, consequences help us determine which action is more in keeping with what is already our duty. Consequences help us find out what our duty is. They are not what makes something our duty. I hope that's clear. Now, second, humans should be treated as objects of intrinsic moral value, that is, as ends in themselves and never as a mere means to some other end, say overall happiness or the welfare of society. This notion is very difficult to justify if one abandons the theological doctrine of man made in the image of God, the imago Dei of Genesis 1:27. Nevertheless, justified or unjustified, deontological ethics implies that humans are ends in themselves with intrinsic values. Third, a moral principle is a categorical imperative. Now, what do we mean by that? That is, it is universal. It is applicable to everyone who is in the same moral situation. Moral statements do not say, if you want to maximize pleasure versus pain in this instance, then do such and such rather. Moral statements are obligations or commands that hold for all examples of the type of the act in consideration, such as truth-telling. Moral statements say, keep your promises, do not murder, and so forth. There is an important bit of information that students need to know about deontology. Although the categorical imperative is very similar to the golden rule of Christianity, Judaism, and many other religions, that is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, deontologism generally rejects any moral theory grounded in God or a higher absolute truth. This is very important as we go forward, and you'll see why. One of the reasons is because of the influence of the Enlightenment through Immanuel Kant, who sought a rational, non-theistic basis for values. At its core, deontological ethics is a naturalistic, duty-based theory of objective, cultural morality that somehow transcends and connects the subjective realities of each individual in the culture. There are a lot of questions as to whether deontology really works. In fact, not everyone agrees that it does. An example of skepticism over deontology is seen in the writings of Dr. Joel Marks. Dr. Joel Marks is one of the latest scholars of deontological ethics to publicly declare that there is no difference between right or wrong. In fact, as an ethicist scholar at the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale University, Professor Marks now honestly believes, and this is a quote, "The religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality. But they are incorrect, I still believe, about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality." That ends the quote. As a naturalist atheist, Marx used to hold to the deontological view of morality, Allegedly, the view does not require God a transcendent standard to distinguish between right and wrong. However, Marx now maintains that the theory of deontological ethics is just as unreasonable as believing in the divine. Through a series of articles in Philosophy Now, Dr. Marx fully developed his amoral manifesto. In the process, he had an anti-epiphany, in which he rejected deontology and realized that morality was nothing more than a fuzzy subjective feeling. This is an extended quote I'd like to read for you. He says, "I retain my strong preferences for honest dialectical dealings in a context of mutual respect. It's just that I am no longer giving premises to moral arguments. Rather, I am offering considerations to help us figure out what to do. I'm not attempting to justify anything. I am trying to motivate informed and reflective choices. But this won't be because of a God, a supernatural law, or even my own conscience told me I must, I ought, I have an obligation. Instead, I will be moved by my head and my heart. Morality has nothing to do with it." That's at the end of the quote. Now, where do we go from here? Is morality no more than feelings, what the community standards are, what I just think is the best thing to do? Well, Christians need to understand that deontology, or rules-based ethics, can have a foundation that does not change. Although our culture and community may influence some aspects of morality, the law, the Torah, the Ten Commandments, the Sermons on the Mount, the principles of morality that are given in the Bible, those ethical prescriptions in the Bible, provide a basis for universal ethical principles that are unchangeable and provide a basis for responding to ethical problems no matter where or when these issues appear. Therefore, we can have confidence. We can have a confidence that there are universal moral norms based on God's divinely revealed truth. There's a foundation for us to understand what is true. There's a foundation for us to provide unchanging principles, and those unchanging principles allow us to adapt into the complex issues of today's ethical conundrums. Now, this is Dr. Brent Kelly. You will see me next week as we go through another lecture. If you have any questions, write to me. I'll be happy to talk with you, answer any questions. God bless you. Have a great day.